My name is Quentin Turner. I grew up here in Detroit. On the west side on 6 Mile in Livernois. I went to school at Eastern Michigan University. I've lived in Michigan for pretty much my entire life. Was born in Boston to a family of Detroiters who moved back here when I was very young. So this is the place that I've known as home for 30 years. So.
So you're here today to talk about water security and water insecurity.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that means for you? How do you define those terms?
Well, when I think about water security, I think about the way water is defined underneath the UN, which is, water needs to be clean, affordable, accessible, in order to be, and it's considered a human right. And so in my eyes, water security is that every human and every person has access to water that is clean, affordable, and accessible. And water insecurity, I think, is a situation that we find ourselves in present day, which is that many people don't have access to water on that level. That I think is the standard for a human right.
Why is this a burning issue for us here in Detroit?
For lots of reasons. Well, first of all, I'll start by saying water is life, and water is the key to life. And so it will be a burning issue. It's just an essential part of who we are as people. We can't exist without water, so it is a major issue for us. It's a particularly large issue here in Detroit because we exist in the Great Lakes Basin. The history of the city is tied deeply to the Detroit River. So the city is connected to water historically and culturally since its founding, and it became the economic hub it was because of the Detroit River. And so we have a very close proximity to fresh water, some of the largest sources of fresh water in our country. And right now, a lot of Detroiters are facing issues affording water, and they don't have access to affordable water. And so that's a particular problem that's being faced here in the communities of Detroit.
So I know. So you're a community organizer with the Sierra Club, although you're not speaking for the Sierra Club today. And water affordability is not traditionally an issue which is taken up by Sierra Clubs worldwide or across the country. So how does water affordability or security, how does that align with the Sierra Club as well as what you're doing in general as a community organizer?
Yeah, so the Sierra Club is a really old organization with a lot of history that isn't necessarily on the same side as people who are striving for social change. And in recent years, the club has recognized that the people who are most adversely affected by climate change and environmental degradation are the communities of color and the low-income communities, which are a lot of Detroit has a lot of those communities within it. I think Detroit's primarily a city of color, and we do have a pretty large low-income population. And so the Sierra Club's mission is to engage people in the environment as well as protect our natural lands and waters, and to foster land and water stewardship inside of people. And they recognize that there is a large community that has not been served by the club in the past, that I feel like we need to be able to have equal access. That nature is deserved to be enjoyed by all, and not just a particular set of people from a particular background. And so in order to ensure that, we got to have water that is good quality and clean, that people can use for recreation as well as for drinking. And so I think it ties directly to the type of work that we believe in and the type of mission that we have, because water quality is an issue that we've been behind for years. And we see that it's the people who really need help with that issue, and the people that are most affected by that issue are low-income communities.
So as you're working on this issue for several years now, what are some of the broader public implications of water insecurity or lack of access to good, clean water? What are some of the broader implications as far as the city and the neighborhoods and the communities are concerned?
I mean, one of the largest ones in my mind is that it's a human rights violation. People not having access to water and having their water shut off. So, that in of itself is, I think, an ethical dilemma that is being faced by public utilities. But beyond that, I would say that if you have less ratepayers who are paying to the system because their water has been shut off, that leads to reduced funding of our water infrastructure system, which makes our water infrastructure system more vulnerable to many of the frequent storms that we're seeing. And so right now, our water infrastructure is paid for primarily by people who use the infrastructure. So people all across the city of Detroit. And when people are not paying into that because it's either too expensive or their water has been shut off, then that means that people who are paying into that have to pay more. And it also means that there's less income going into our infrastructure, which is already degrading as it is now. And so it really becomes a problem to get everyone access to clean water if we start cutting off people's access to clean water. The smaller pool there are people paying into the system, the more every individual person's going to have to pay. And then the more difficult it is for people to pay. And it just becomes, a repeating cycle from there. Right. Water gets more expensive, less people can pay it. Water gets more expensive, less people can pay it. So,
yeah. Stop.
We're at 6 minutes and 30 seconds.
Oh my God. Okay, sorry. So you were talking earlier about looking at how communities of color and low income are especially affected by environmental changes, and I'm thinking especially of the flooding that we've been having for a while now. Actually, Wayne County and Detroit in particular, we just went through a few days of that recently.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about examples and instances like that, huge stormwater surges, and I know that your organization does a lot of great work with rain barrels and green stormwater work. How do you align, or how do you try to explain what people are experiencing with these things around stormwater surges with the impact on low income and people of color communities?
Yeah, so I usually point out the fact that our water infrastructure is really old here in Detroit. There's rumors that we have wooden pipes underneath the city, and I've heard some people have even seen them. I haven't personally, but these are things that I've heard. And our infrastructure is old and it's aging and it's crumbling and failing a lot of us. I mean, that's one of the reasons why there are such problems with flooding. And in the past, the federal government would supply a lot of funding for that to improve the infrastructure, but presently that's just not the case. And therefore, the people who are using the system have to pay more in order to maintain it. And it's really just at a breaking point. It's old, crumbling infrastructure being tested by increasingly more potent storms because of climate change, and it's just not up to the challenge. And yeah, that's kind of how I explain it to people. Is we just have a really old system that needs investment and needs care, and it can't be upon, people can't fix their sewer system. Your homeowner can't just break into the ground and start fixing their pipes on their own. It can't be, it's not something that can be privately solved. It needs to be funded and it needs to be paid for by the government.
So, as you know, a lot of Detroit residents have had their water connections shut off at least since 2013. You've had these mass-scale, thousands of households being shut off. And I know that you personally have not experienced that, but I want to know a little bit about, how you react to the news around you when you're hearing stories of people around you. Maybe for the people that you meet through your work or in your community. Can you reflect a little bit on this process of knowing about the shutoffs and how it affects you?
Well, so I started organizing with the Sierra Club a little over a year ago.
Okay.
And that's really when I came into the area on water infrastructure and started really learning about the things that have been happening in this area. And, I've heard stories of, families' homes being shut down, and therefore, because these households don't have access to clean water, that puts them and makes them considered an endangered environment for children. So, potentially Child Protective Services can come and like separate families. And that is absolutely like, it blew my mind that these type of things could be happening in my city. And it just seems like a total, like, just like I said, a moral like sinkhole for water utilities and for our community, for our city. The idea that I've heard about people not being able to clean, and therefore there's been an increase in diseases. I think hepatitis A is one that's been investigated pretty heavily recently. And just like the idea of not being able to go home and drink a glass of water, take a shower, which is something I find so like personally relieving after a long day, or just like a busy day of working and being able to clean myself. To deny that to people is just unimaginable to me. And so I personally have not been affected by a water shutoff, but I mean, I can't abide hearing about the things that have happened to other people in the city of Detroit.
So one of the things that seems striking in what you just said was how you started hearing all this only about a year ago after working with the Sierra Club. Although these things have been happening now for years now. So why do you think that is? Is that a narrative that you think a lot of people, even people who live in the city, are not so familiar with?
I think that I wasn't as personally engaged with a lot of the people who were affected by this in the previous roles that I had at other jobs. They were located either not really within the city, or I didn't really talk directly with people who were being affected by these things. I wasn't in those communities. So I was aware of the water shutoffs, but I guess I wasn't as aware as I could be.
It was at the periphery.
Right, exactly.
And at the periphery, was it something that, what was that experience like? Like, it was at the periphery, but you didn't know it was that serious, or?
Well, a lot of it was also my understanding of justice too.
Yeah.
So, it was in the periphery, and I was still trying to come to terms of understanding what social justice really is,
Right.
What water justice really is, and what environmental justice really is. And these are all things that I've learned over the past probably like 3 or 4 years and have really grappled with the concepts of. I have a background in biology and environmental science. So when I got into studying the environment and the climate, it came from a position of just intellectual,
Right.
like research, problem solving, and very removed from people in a lot of ways. It's more understanding what's happening to the environment and not necessarily what's happening to people. And as I've progressed in my career over my 20s up until now, I've learned more about the way that the environment is affecting people, and how it is it's affecting some people far more than others, and the issue and the burden of climate change is not being equitably shared in our society, and I feel like that's one of the driving forces behind the lack of movement behind it, because some people feel like, well, this isn't bothering me, I'm in a position where I can be safe, so I don't need to think about it, while other people are, this may be I may be in a position where I can't deal with this, but I have so many other things I have to deal with that I can't even focus on it. And so I felt like, as someone who had the knowledge of climate change and the knowledge of environmental science, that I could at least provide some support to those communities that are affected more harshly by it, but may not have an organized voice yet, or may not have a complete grasp of the things that are going on. Just being able to be there where I can became really important to me. I work at the Sierra Club full time, but I also work part time at the Michigan Science Center as an educator. So I still have a passion for science, and I want to be able to make science and nature as easily accessible to people. I don't want people to feel like there's a barrier, or it's just they can't do it. I think everyone can kind of grasp it, so it's a really big personal driver of mine to make complex things a little bit easier to understand. But while working with the Sierra Club, or while I'm doing my job with the Sierra Club, I partnered with lots of organizations across the region. Our primary partner would be the Friends of the Rouge, who work in the Rouge River watershed. And then the two of us together run a program called Rain Gardens to the Rescue. So Friends of the Rouge and Sierra Club both recognize the problem of aging stormwater infrastructure and what the increased storms mean for the water quality of both the Rouge and the Detroit River. And so we see together a solution of rain gardens, which are a type of bioretention. We see that as being a solution to this issue by capturing stormwater before it gets to the drain. And so we go out into Detroit neighborhoods for the past 4 or 5 years now, and we offer free rain gardens to community members who are willing to learn about what a rain garden is, how they work, how to install them, and how to maintain them. And so we're actually in the middle of those workshops right now. We have 10 people from districts 3 and 4, so on the east side of Detroit, who we are working with and teaching about rain gardens, and sometime in September we'll be starting with the planting of those rain gardens. So that's kind of the primary thing that I do, but there are many other projects that I work on with other organizations, sometimes not necessarily as a long-term project. So for example, today I was at Davidson Elementary School, and I talked about rain gardens, and I talked about rainwater and native plants to Mrs. Foster's first grade class.
Oh, cool.
So, I'm not always necessarily working with adults. I'm not always necessarily working with one organization continuously. You know, it's a lot of just working with people wherever I can, meeting them where they're at, and trying to find what's a good solution for the
Cultivating
situation.
young minds.
Yes. Yeah.
So, when you were talking about water and rain gardens with kids, how do you address the topic with them? Do you use maybe like different frames to introduce the topic and why they should be interested in that, as opposed to when you're talking with adults, for instance, or do you find it quite similar?
I find it a little similar. I cut back on the jargon as much, and I realize that children are really observant. Like they're aware of the things happening around them, and sometimes they just need a voice to be able to articulate those observations. So I'll ask them about who's seen flooding in the streets, in their basements, and a lot of kids have stories about at least seeing a flood in the streets. And they have an understanding that water comes down from the sky, and if it falls on the grass, it'll go into the ground, or the grass will suck it up. But if it falls on the sidewalk, it won't go into the ground. And I think that those basic observations are the beginning of an understanding of, okay, well, if it doesn't go into the ground, then where does it go, and what does that mean? And I can kind of talk them through it just based on things that they see every day. So really, they know, they just maybe haven't built the bridges necessarily, and so I'm there to kind of help make those links with just the things that they see in their everyday life. But in addition to that, it helps with the first graders when you use games. So I'll use Simon Says to help with different things about what sound does rain make? What do plants do when they get rain? What kind of pollinators come to our plants once they grow? And they get an understanding of how these things are connected. So yeah, it's a little different, but it's still, there's still some similarities.
Cool.
Yeah.
So when you're talking you talked about the Rain Gardens to the Rescue program. Tell us a little bit about that program first of all. And then after that, I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about some of the concerns that the Detroit residents, the adults, really have when you're in that context.
So that program is funded by the Herb Family Foundation, and we're in our second year of a 3-year grant right now. But this is like I said, the 5th year that this has been going on overall. And so we put out a call for applications. We get applications from people in particular neighborhoods that we're aiming at for that year. We then do site visits with the different applicants to see whether or not they have the space for a rain garden on their property. We aim the Rain Gardens to the Rescue program at residential homeowners, though in the past year we've gotten a lot of interest from faith-based organizations and churches. So last year we had at least 2 or 3 churches that applied and were accepted, and we did some installations there. And one of the primary things that we see from the applicants who do get accepted and become a part of the program, They go through 4 workshops. Traditionally, this year we're actually doing 5 workshops. In each workshop, we talk about a different aspect of rain gardens, installation, native plants, the whole system and how it works. And then they get an opportunity to design their own rain garden. They get to choose native plants that we procure from another partner of ours, Keep Growing Detroit usually. And they get a chance to design the rain garden on their own house or on their own property where they want the plants. And then we eventually do a planting day a couple months after that once the weather is not as hot. But like I was saying before, a frequent question we get, especially recently and especially since I started, is usually about the drainage charge. That's a big one, just because that's a really big change that happened in the past about 2 or 3 years that everyone in Detroit is aware of at this point. So, there's usually a lot of conversation around the drainage charge, drainage credits are the green credits portion of that charge. And then it also leads in the conversation about water infrastructure, which I think a lot of people are somewhat aware of, but I think there's a breakdown at some point. The way that our infrastructure systems are set up, they're meant to be invisible and seamless to everyday life. Your water goes down the drain and you're not supposed to think about where it goes next after that. And so a lot of the program is highlighting, okay, your water goes down the drain, but like, what does that really mean? What is it carrying with it? And what happens if there's too much water in the system that carries it? And so bringing those things to light, I think is pretty important because people can make more informed decisions in that case.
Yeah, in some of our interviews, for instance, when we ask people, where do you know about your water infrastructure? I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Because, it's, I suppose the invisible and seamless thing works because it makes it seem so convenient, but then it sort of backfires on you because you just take it for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You take both the resource and the infrastructure simply for granted.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's funny, I'll talk to kids about this sometime and I'll say, the water that you guys like flush down the toilet is the same water that comes out of your sink, and their minds are just blown. They're like, what? Like that's the same water? And I'm like, yeah, it's all one water. Like it's just one water, it's all connected. It just moves through different systems, but it always comes back to your house. And we can't make more water. It's we have the water that we have. It is where it is right now. It's gotten there over millions of years of Earth's life, and we can't make more of it. So we have to protect what we have, and we have to be considerate and think about, what we're putting down the drain, because that eventually is going to come back. That may come back to us through our faucet. So, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the drainage charge issue? Because that is a big issue, and so it'd be really helpful if you could maybe talk us through, the history of, this issue and, how it basically contextualize it for us.
Yeah, well, I don't have a complete understanding of it, but this is kind of what I've garnered since learning about it about a year and a half ago or so. The drainage charge has been on the water bills in Detroit for probably like 50 years, since 1977, I think it was. And it was put on there as a way to raise funds for preventing combined sewage overflows from getting into the Rouge and Detroit River. So prior to the 1970s, when there was too much water in our combined sewer system, which combines the wastewater from a house and the stormwater from the sky, they all go into the same pipe and then eventually go to a water treatment facility. When there was too much water, there were these outfalls located along the river that would just dump the untreated sewage into the water. And at one point, the Rouge River was the most polluted river in the entire country, if not the world. One of the reasons for that was because of these outfalls of untreated sewage and water just going in there. So the federal government and the state government both put out regulations saying that you can't just dump raw sewage into the water. You need to do something about this problem. And so the drainage charge was established as a way to pay for infrastructure to prevent that from happening. Since then, I know that the city of Detroit has invested almost $2 billion in CSO management, and they've been able to capture like 95% of all CSOs before they get to the Detroit or Rouge rivers. But that last 5%, in order to capture that last little bit, they still have to invest potentially another $1 billion of infrastructure. So the drainage charge isn't new per se. It's been ongoing for decades now. The way that it was calculated in the past was that it was based off of a lot of different metrics depending on the parcel of land you owned. And if you never got a water bill, so like say if you owned a lot that was just a parking lot and you don't get water bills, then you would never get a drainage charge, even though you're contributing, like a parking lot's contributing a lot of water to the system,
Right.
but they're not getting a water bill, so they don't get charged. So the way that they changed it a few years ago was that everyone gets charged equally with the same rate. And then they gave homeowners an automatic 25% credit of whatever that rate they would have gotten, under the assumption that their downspouts were disconnected. And that's the new system, which isn't exclusive to Detroit. There are a lot of utilities across the country that I know have systems that are similar to this. But I think that it was rolled out very poorly, and it was not if you don't know anything about what water infrastructure is or does, and all of a sudden you're hearing about being charged for it, and you may not even know that you were in the past. There's a lot of questions that could come out of that. And then on top of the fact that there are all these water shutoffs happening, it's just I'm not sure how all of that could happen at once, where it's a good idea to change your drainage system, inform people of this thing that maybe they've never heard of before, while also shutting off their access to water. It's just it was very, very poorly managed, in my opinion. But it's one of those things that is not new per se, but is just been changed, and in a way that I just think wasn't well thought out.
Yeah, I mean, because it's been critiqued, for instance, in a lot of the press, as well as in community gatherings, is the rain tax, the tax on rain, for instance. Is that valid? That criticism?
I don't think the rain tax is an accurate description of what the drainage charge is, because in principle, if you think about it, we all are using the water infrastructure system in some way, either through active use of drinking water out of our taps, or through passive use of having water flow off of our properties into the drainage system, into the storm drains. So we're all utilizing this system. So it would make sense that we would all have to contribute and share to maintain that system. And that, in my mind, makes sense. I think where it falls apart is the fact that there has never really been any education about how our infrastructure system works. So people are just finding out about this for the first time.
It's a new tax.
It's a new tax, right?
Yes.
But it's not new, and it does make sense. And also, I think that the burden isn't necessarily equitably shared amongst all parcel owners. So even though the rate is the same, I actually looked up the numbers recently, and I tried to work them out, and I don't know how accurate these are. So, I know I'm on video, so I was going to say don't quote me, but nonetheless, the Renaissance Center has 11.7 acres of impervious acreage, and that's 11.7 acres of just hard surface that water will roll off of. The way that the drainage charge is set up is that you have to pay $598 per impervious acre. So you do the math, 598 times 11.7, that ended up being I think $7,500 a year, $7,500 a month in drainage charges, which equates to something like $85,000 a year for GM to have to pay for the Renaissance Center. Now that's basically like GM hiring a new full-time employee.
Right.
That is peanuts of a drainage charge for them to have to pay, given the scope and size of their company. And I'm assuming that GM is one that owns the property of the Renaissance Center is on. Maybe they don't. But for a small business owner in Detroit, $85,000 a year can be a lot of money, and that can be the difference between your business thriving and your business falling apart. And so I feel like, even though in theory the drainage charge is equitable, because it is theoretically, we exist in a system that is inequitable by its nature. So there's no way that it can be equitably distributed unless that's taken into account.
So I can see how this would affect small business owners, owners of commercial plazas or commercial outdoor malls,
Hmm.
but also faith-based organizations and
Yes.
churches for parking lots. Um, would this affect residents though?
The drainage charge does affect residents because it is a part of their water bill.
Okay.
Um, the way that it's been publicized is that most people will see a decrease, and a few with large lots would see an increase. And you know,
So large impervious lots.
large impervious like parcels of land. So if you have a
Right.
big house or a big driveway or like three shacks in the back of your house or
Right.
whatever, like you might see a increase, but most people should see a decrease. Now I don't own property in Detroit. I don't own property in Detroit, and so I can't say for sure whether or not that's the case because I don't get a water bill. But a lot of people who I know who've owned property, people I've talked to in the community, said that they've actually seen an increase for the most part. So for anyone out there who wants to do the math, I think the old rate for residential properties was $20.53 was the standard drainage charge. So if you can compare, I guess, one of your old bills to one of your new bills, you can see whether or not you're paying more in drainage. I know in the old bills, drainage wasn't highlighted as a line item. It was kind of rolled into the sewer line.
Okay.
So that's another way that that information was not clearly like made available to people. So really, the lack of clear information has been a huge problem in people's acceptance and understanding of this drainage charge.